Hello and welcome to a new series of videos on the theme of international security. So these are a set of lectures that I've given in person recently. They're not something that I've created specifically for YouTube, but I thought that since I had them recorded already, I might as well upload them here, and hopefully someone out there will find them useful. So this first lecture covers the basic concept of international security, different definitions of security, different ways of thinking about security, and how the field of security studies as a subfield of international relations has shifted in recent decades. And really broadened to include new conceptualizations of security beyond the kind of traditional state-on-state warfare realist kind of model. So subsequent lectures will look at different aspects of security. So the next one will be talking about traditional state-on-state warfare. The one after that will be looking at civil war. Then we'll look at themes including terrorism, international crime, and then new sort of definitions and different aspects of security, which have kind of come to the fore more recently. So the idea of things like water security and food security and energy security, health security, and so on. So again, I hope that you'll find these useful. And if you do find these or any other of my content helpful, then a like and a subscribe would be very much appreciated.
Okay, so let's dive straight in and let's talk about security. So again, the obvious question is, what is security? What do we mean when we talk about security? Well, again, I'm kind of fond of going back to the dictionary in a sense as a starting point. So let's look at the dictionary definition of security. The state of being free from danger or threat. So we're talking about securing something or someone from danger, from threat. But that raises the obvious questions then. Well, whose security? Security of what or whom? You know, who or what are we securing? And what sort of threat? What do we mean by a threat? So we can express this in terms, and this is something that will come up several times throughout the module, the idea of the referent object, which might sound a bit of a, a concept to kind of get your head around. But all the referent object means is the thing that we are referring to. In other words, what is the thing that we are securing? That is the referent object. The referent object is the thing that we are securing. And that's going to change depending on what kinds of security we're talking about. So, if we're talking about traditional approaches to security, what we might call national security approaches, the kind of stuff that a realist would recognise, then usually we're defining security in terms of the state. We're talking about threats to the state, usually military threats or quasi-military, i.e. insurgencies or terrorism and so on. In this case, the state itself is the referent object. The state itself is the thing that we want to secure. Okay? But in recent decades, I mean, not just going to say recent years, but certainly in recent decades, since 1980s onwards, really, the approach to security has kind of broadened within IR. So, kind of redefining security, not just in national security terms. Not that national security has gone away and we can ignore that now, but I'm saying that that is not enough. Looking at security just in terms of national security is not enough. We need to be thinking about human security. And again, we did mention this briefly last year in UIR, although we didn't dwell on it a lot. We did mention it when we touched on feminism and so on, and critical theory. We talked about human security. So human security approaches are not focused on the state. Human security approaches are focused on people, which is not necessarily the same thing. Because for a start, it might be the state itself that is the threat to human security. And if you think about it, if you've got kind of an oppressive state, and particularly a state which is maybe targeting minority groups, it might be the state itself which is the threat to human security. But also, when we talk about human security, we're not just necessarily just talking about military or quasi-military threats either. We're talking about other kinds of threats. So again, if you're living in poverty and you're starving, you don't have enough to eat, that is the biggest threat to your security. You know, you're not particularly worrying about tanks coming over the border. I mean, you might be worrying about that, but, you know, the biggest threat to your survival is the fact that you don't have any food. That's the thing that is threatening your security at this moment in time. So, you know, hunger could be a threat to your security, or disease could be a threat to your security, or lack of water could be a threat to your security, or problems with energy supply, you know, might be a threat both to your security and to national security as well. You know, some of these things, we're talking about things like health security or economic security or, you know, energy security or any of these. They could be threats both to human security and to national security as well. We could see them through both lenses. So when we're talking about human security, the referent object, the thing that we are securing, is something other than the state. So it might be the population, it might be a part of the population, a group within the population, or it might be individuals. But it's something other than the state forms the referent object. So let's talk about traditional security first of all, and that will be the theme certainly for next week. We'll be talking about national security and stuff that a realist would recognise. So if we kind of look at some images, you know, if we think about national security, think about traditional security, these are kind of some of the kinds of images that we might recognise. Thanks very much, cheers. I'm not sure whose pen that is. Anybody wants to claim that pen, it's just at the front here. So, yeah, the National Security Agency of the US, for example, the NSA. Or we might think of military intelligence, and again, we might think in terms of, you know, cyber security. So, the National Cyber Security Centre in the UK, which is a division of GCHQ, General Communications Headquarters. We might think of fighter jets, we might think of soldiers with rifles, we might think of aircraft carriers, or more broadly, sort of naval forces, and so on. And again, a realist would argue that every state aims to be as strong as it can, which, you know, involves building up this sort of stuff, military hardware, military personnel, and so on, or perhaps even things like, you know, weapons of mass destruction, things like nuclear weapons. But of course, in reality, it's not that easy, because domestic politics, certainly in the present day, domestic politics demands that we spend, you know, our governments spend on other things. If we go back to before the First World War, a very high percentage of the UK's government budget, something like a quarter, went into the military, and the vast majority of that into the Royal Navy. In fact, I think at one time, just something like a third of all government spending. Today, that will be completely impossible, you know, because if we did that, you know, the NHS, there would be no welfare state, you know, there would be limited spending on things like education and so on. which of course in today's world wouldn't be politically acceptable. Any government that said, right, we're going to shut down the NHS and spend all the money on the military is not going to get elected. So governments have to balance, have to find the right balance. So, you know, the old saying is guns and butter. How many guns, how much butter? You know, how do governments balance military spending against other priorities? And that's something that they're having to continually wrestle with. I mean, again, we look at the UK in you know, since the end of the Cold War, and of course the so-called peace dividends, military spending as a percentage of government spending has steadily been reduced, and the size of the British Armed Forces has steadily been reduced since the end of the Cold War, because there's this feeling, well, we don't need all of this stuff anymore. Now, of course, with the perception of a resurgent threat from Russia, a lot of people are saying, well, this has gone too far. The British Army is now way too small. The Royal Navy is way too small. The Army is way too small. We need more military spending. But where's that money going to come from at a time when budgets are already tight? So that's the dilemma now faced by the British government and many other dilemmas. You know, the reality is that the budget is not balancing, and the government is struggling to make the sums add up. So where does the money come from? You know, there is general agreement that, you know, the threat from Russia warrants increased military spending again, but where does that money come from? So difficult political choices. What do we mean by the state anyway? I mean, again, we talked about this in UIR. What is a state? State, of course, ultimately is a legal entity. Ultimately, it's a concept. It exists because we all believe that it does. You know, I mean, we can point to the institutions of the state, we can point to Parliament and, you know, the government, and we can point to things like the courts and, you know, the police, and, you know, the armed forces and various other, you know, government agencies. Lots of government agencies, the civil service, all of that. You know, those are the institutions of the state. Ultimately, what is the state itself? Ultimately, the state is a concept, and it's a legal entity. But in the traditional view of security, that abstract concept is the thing that we are securing, ultimately. So, is the state the same thing as the people? Sometimes, you know, or very often, particularly during wartime, or times of national crisis, you know, governments have used this rhetoric that, you know, there is no difference, that, you know, the nation, the people and the state are one and the same, or at least the interests of the state are one and the same. But is that always the case? So the state benefits and it threatens. So it can benefit us, but it can also threaten us. Now it is us, and often it is them. You know, do we really feel that the state is us? You know, or do we feel that actually it's them screwing us over, taking our taxes, whatever? You know, do we identify with the state, or do we see the state as, you know, something which perhaps causes us problems even? It is an abstraction, but in its name, men. It's a gendered term. This is from 1964. We could say people are jailed or made rich on oil depletion allowances, defence contracts, killed in wars. So yeah, it's an abstraction, but it's a very real thing in the sense that we are all subservient to it, to the point of life and death. And it can come to that, particularly when we're talking about matters of war and peace. Now, of course, we know that from a realist perspective, and even to a large extent from a liberal perspective, although the liberals focus also on international organisations, but from a kind of traditional IR perspective, states are traditionally seen as the most important actors in international politics. Now, again, as we know from last year, states are not the only actors in international politics. We have intergovernmental organisations and non-governmental organisations, we have corporations, we have terror groups, we have crime syndicates, we have all kinds of other actors on the world stage as well. but of course states are special in that they possess sovereignty, i.e. final authority, at least in legal theory, over a given territory. So again, we can define the state in different ways. We can define it in organisational terms. So if we're talking about organisational terms, the state is a recognisable institution, the state is a formal legal entity, the state is sovereign, it has supreme power within its territory, the state's sovereignty extends to all individuals within a given territory and applies equally to all, including those in government. State personnel are recruited and trained for management in a bureaucratic matter, and the state has the capacity to extract monetary revenues, in other words, to tax and spend. Now again, this is where some of the issues arise around recognition of states, and of course this is very topical. This weekend the British government chose to recognise Palestine. Now, again, you have your own view on that, whether you think that's a good thing or not a good thing. But it is somewhat problematic in a way, in the sense that Palestine doesn't really meet this definition, at least not at present. You know, what is its territory? Well, it's not really clearly defined. I mean, we could go back to the UN partition plan from 1946 and say that's Palestinian territory. In practice, you know, Israel controls most of it. Is there a Palestinian government? Well, not really. I mean, you've got the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. You've got Hamas, you know, which is widely seen as a terror group, running Gaza, empowering Gaza. So there's not a single government in Palestine. There is not a properly developed bureaucracy. There is not really the capacity to rule, you know, within Palestinian territory, which is not even defined anyway. You know, so in a lot of ways, I mean, again, how do you get to be sovereign? It's through recognition by other sovereigns. Now, the UK and others have kind of recognised Palestine at a formal level. But is there actually a Palestinian state that is recognisable as a state? Now, you might argue that there should be, and that's a different argument. But right now, as it is at the moment today, is there a Palestinian state? And that's debatable. You could argue that there is, in formal legal terms, if enough countries recognise it. But is it anything more than an abstraction? Is there really a Palestinian state? So, you know, again, that's something that we can discuss. But that kind of illustrates the issues around what is a state, you know, what actually constitutes a state. Is it just a matter of formal legal recognition, or is there more to state actually being a viable state? And of course, you know, we can say the same about other states as well. So if we look at states like Somalia, you know, again, Somalia is generally recognised as a state. It's a UN member even, but you know, there's not kind of been a functioning government which has effectively controlled the whole of Somali territory for decades now, which is why Somalia is frequently referred to as a failed state. You know, it exists on paper, but it doesn't really function as a state in practice. So think about what the state is. And again, particularly this is the case if we define the state in functional terms. We define the state by its consequences. So, for example, the state is the thing that maintains social order. But again, not all recognised states necessarily do this or are able to do this. So, yeah, think about definitions of the state, and that's important because ultimately the state is the thing we are securing. The states generally are said to have fixed territories with mutually exclusive borders. What does that mean? Well, basically the state has absolute unlimited authority up to that line, and then the state's jurisdiction stops there. So if I'm in France here, and I step over the border here to Germany, and left French jurisdiction, I'm now under German jurisdiction. There's no overlap. You know, one state's jurisdiction finishes at the border, again in legal theory. And again, States have legal sovereignty within their own territory, so they have the power of life and death. They have the power to make any decisions, to pass any laws. They have ultimate power over their citizens, at least in legal theory. So sovereignty means that the state has universal authority. It has authority over all affairs. It has supreme authority. There is no higher power above the state. It has exclusive authority. There are no alternative sources of authority, or at least none at the same level as the state. So again, there are other sources of authority. So, you know, if you work for a company, for example, you've got a boss over you, and there's a management structure, and they have authority over you within, your sort of role within that company. But their sort of authority is lesser than, is kind of subservient to the state's authority. So if the state passes a law saying that your boss has to pay you more, that is the law, and your boss doesn't have any wiggle room, at least not legally. So the state is the highest source of authority, and there are no alternative sources of authority at the same level as the state. Sovereignty, again, sometimes defined in terms of a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. So again, if the local drug gang comes and kicks your door in and beats you up, that's a use of force, but it's not a legitimate use of force. Whereas if the police come and kick your door in and drag you up, provided they've acted within the law, and again that's something you can argue about in court, but provided they've acted within the law, that is a legitimate use of force, because the police are authorised to use force by the state. So states have a monopoly, again in theory, on the legitimate, what is deemed to be the legitimate use of force. And states are expected to respect each other's sovereignty, so they rule that states don't interfere in each other's internal affairs. Within their borders, they have supreme authority. They don't interfere in each other's legal affairs. Again, in legal theory, we know in practice it doesn't always work like that, but that's the legal theory. So what constitutes a threat to a state? So basically, a threat to a state, I guess we could define as something that threatens the functioning of the state activity. And again, I'm sure we can think of lots of possible examples. So attack from another state, spying, subversion, terrorism. It could be, coming from their own population. It could be revolution. Could be insurrection. It could be a natural disaster, an earthquake, or it could be things like climate change, things like asteroid strikes. But it also could be things like economic failure, economic collapse, mass poverty, mass hunger. Again, that's a threat to people, but it's a threat to the state as well. Civil disasters, nuclear power plants blowing up, biological contamination, industrial pollution, climate change we've already mentioned. All of these can potentially threaten the state and the functioning of the state, along with various others. But which of these are the most important threats, and which ones should we be most focused on? Again, not everyone is going to agree on that. And that's partly what this module is about. It's about looking at different perspectives on security, because different perspectives are going to give different answers to these questions. Which threats are the ones that we should be most worried about? So this is what we call basically a security paradigm. So again, in UIR last year, of course, we came across the idea of a theoretical paradigm, and all a paradigm is, it's a way of looking at things. It's a way of viewing the world. So this is why, again, from UIR, you kind of remember we talked about the role of theory, why theory is important. Stefano Gazzini said that there is no knowable fact without an underlying theory which gives meaning to it. In other words, we're always using theory, whether we admit to it or not. And again, there are those who reject that. And in history, there are quite a lot of traditionalist historians. I've no time for theory. We're doing empirical history. But actually, I would say that they're kidding themselves. They are using theory, whether they admit to it or not, because theory is nothing more or less than a conceptual framework that allows us to make sense of the world. And without such a conceptual framework, you know, there's just a bunch of stuff. Whether we're looking at historical fact or whether we're looking at present day, it's just a bunch of stuff. To actually interpret it and make sense of what it means, then we have to apply a conceptual framework. And whether we call that a formal theory or not, we're still using a conceptual framework. So if we're thinking about things like, you know, the state itself, if we're thinking about ideas like sovereignty, or we're thinking about ideas like security, you know, these are all concepts. These are all socially constructed concepts, which we, you know, the idea of the nation, you know, the idea of the law, the idea of money, for example. These are all concepts which we apply, which we all, you know, agree that these things exist, which is why they exist, because we mutually understand what these things are. So theory, whether we call it theory or not, is the conceptual framework that we use to make sense of the world. So a paradigm is a set of assumptions, concepts, values and practices that constitutes a way of viewing reality in a community that shares them, especially in an intellectual discipline. And again, this includes tacit as well as objective knowledge. In other words, what we assume is just as important as what is actually there. And the assumptions are as important as the material reality. So our assumptions, the way that we view the world, affect how we view the world. So the old phrase, seeing is believing, is it the other way around in actual fact? Is it that what we believe affects what we see, or at least the way that we interpret what we see? You know, to what extent is reality socially constructed? What we perceive is subject to the limitations of our own assumptions, our own conceptual framework, and you can never really get away from that. But at the same time, because this is socially constructed, it can be changed as well. So you're always going to have a set of assumptions about the world, but those assumptions can change. And again, I'm not talking necessarily at an individual level, I'm talking at a societal level, or at a, you know, a theoretical level within an academic discipline. The way that we view the world can change. And that is what we call a paradigm shift. Thomas Kuhn, I think we kind of mentioned last year when we talked about constructivism, popularised this idea of a paradigm shift. So the idea that academic advancement is not always a slow, steady evolution. Sometimes something comes along which completely revolutionises our view of the world. You know, so in physics, it will be something like, you know, Einstein's general theory of relativity, that completely revolutionised physics. Or in biology and you know, associated subjects like medicine, Darwin's theory of evolution completely transformed the whole discipline. So again, changing worldviews. Once upon a time, people believed that the Earth was flat, and that if you sailed too far, you'd fall off the edge. Which might seem a bit silly to us, but you know, to many medieval Europeans, you know, this was their worldview. This was reality as they perceived it. Of course, it wasn't actual reality, but that was their worldview. Or the idea that Earth is the centre of the universe, and that the Sun orbits the Earth, the so-called geocentric model of the universe. This was accepted as the standard model in the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. And of course, Copernicus, first of all, came along and said, I mean, actually, in ancient Greece, some people didn't realise that the sun is the centre of the solar system. But leaving aside ancient Greece, Copernicus first first person in our sort of, in relatively recent centuries have kind of recognised that the sun is the centre of the solar system. Copernicus died not long after kind of publishing this, so wasn't really punished. And of course, Galileo, a little bit later, Galileo Galilei, said the same thing and was put on trial for heresy. Because the Catholic Church saw this as a blasphemy, because their reading of the Bible said that, or they kind of interpreted it at least to mean that, Earth is the centre of the universe, and therefore, by suggesting something different, Galileo was committing heresy and was actually put on trial and made to say, no, I don't really believe that after all. Of course the church was right all along. But of course, over time, more people did what Galileo did and made the same observations and the same calculations, and it became irrefutable that there's no possible way that Earth is the centre of the solar system or centre of the universe. So because of the weight of evidence, the worldview shifted and it became accepted. Well, the Earth does orbit the sun, the other way around. That's what we mean by a paradigm shift, a big change in the way that we view things. Again, what does this have to do with security? Well, again, it's about how do we view what is meant by security. And again, that paradigm has shifted if we kind of, we look at the shift from a focus on national security and military security towards the focus on human security and different types of security, different aspects of security. This is basically a shift in paradigm in what security means. The dominant security paradigm in any state is going to be dependent on local factors within that state. So what I mean by that is that North Korea is not going to view security in the same way as Norway, for example. And how a state views security is going to depend on lots of factors. It's going to depend partly on the political system within that state. So is it a dictatorship, is it an authoritarian state, or is it a democracy? But also on kind of local conditions. So do you have a potentially aggressive neighbour next door? If you do, then your view on security is going to be a lot different to if you are kind of living in a relatively safe part of the world where you're not likely to get invaded or attacked, for example. So the way that governments think about security is going to be dependent on conditions like that, but also going to change over time. The way that governments think about, governments are still concerned with national security, but even national security might mean something quite different to the British government today compared to 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Maybe, seen in quite different terms. So if we look at, examples of security paradigm shifts, Northern Ireland, of course, went through the phase of the Troubles where, the security paradigm was how do we contain terrorism? The idea that there is a military solution to terrorism. If we send the troops in and shoot the troublemakers, then we'll have peace. And of course that didn't work. So ultimately, peace was only achieved through negotiation, through sitting around and talking. And again, that's not just on the part of the British government, also on the part of the IRA as well. The IRA at one time said, we will never talk to the British government. The IRA saw the British government as a illegitimate power and said we won't talk to them, but eventually did. And eventually kind of conceded that for United Ireland is not going to happen, at least not in the immediate future. But we can come to an agreement about the governance of Northern Ireland, which will at least ensure a much more sort of fair, balanced, inclusive government than was the case in the past. So compromises were made on both sides. So that's a shift from the mentality of war to the mentality of diplomacy and peace negotiations. South Africa, of course, apartheid, and the shift from that to to Mandela's the idea of the Rainbow Coalition and so on. Complete change in thinking. The Cold War, and and the end of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall coming down, and which was symbolic, but hugely symbolic. The end of Cold War thinking, and this shift towards. I was on a kind of. You won't remember the Berlin Wall coming down. I'm quite young myself, but I do remember it. But I remember that time, sort of back end of the 80s, going into the 90s. It was a very optimistic time. There was very much a feeling that Cold War is done now, and the threat of nuclear annihilation, which has hung over all our heads for decades, has suddenly lifted. And suddenly we're we're moving forward into a new era of peace and, a rules-based international order, peace, cooperation, diplomacy, all of that. And of course now, we look around the world and think, maybe that didn't work out as well as we hoped. So perhaps the paradigm is shifting again. So again, think about, is the security of the state the same thing as the security of its citizens? Sometimes it might be, but on the other hand, sometimes it might not be. And sometimes it might even be the state itself which is the threat to the citizens. So realism, again, those of you who have done UIR are familiar with realism already. We'll talk about it more again in the seminar as well. But basically, from a realist perspective, of course, national security always means the security of the state, and the main threat to the state comes from other states. Yes, realists might recognise things like terrorism as a bit of a nuisance, but not really a threat to the state. The IRA or Al-Qaeda or whatever, yes, they can carry out some attacks, and yes, they can, they can kill some people, and obviously that's horrendous. It doesn't actually threaten the survival of the state. It's horrendous for the people involved, for their families, but it doesn't threaten the survival of the state. The only thing that can threaten the survival of a state, apart from perhaps a revolution, is generally other states from a realist perspective. So that's the main thing that realists are focused on. And of course, under conditions of anarchy, according to a realist, states cannot trust each other, would be crazy to trust each other. Therefore, you have to assume everyone's out to get you, and therefore you have to take steps to protect yourself. Under those conditions, therefore, logically we can predict that every state will try to be as strong as possible to deter attack from other states, the peace through strength kind of approach, the deterrence approach. Particularly defensive realists are going to emphasise that, and of course offensive realists will go on further and say that each state is trying to be the hegemon, trying to rule the system. Why? Because if you're the hegemon, then you're on top, and will actively pursue hegemony, particularly if they're in a position to do so. But states also, of course, and particularly if they are not the hegemon, may form alliances with other states for mutual protection. However, such cooperation isn't always tactical, according to a realist, and will break down as soon as the shared threat disappears. Critical security studies is kind of the complete opposite end of the spectrum to realism, because it completely rejects these kind of previously mainstream approaches to security. Approaches security instead through the lens of critical theory. So remember in UIR we talked about various critical paradigms. We talked about dependency, neo-Marxist approaches, critical theory, constructivism, feminism, post-colonialism, all of these linked to emancipatory discourses. So this is the idea of security as freedom from oppression. So, and again, we're changing the referent object. We're not talking about the security of the state anymore. We're talking about the security of people. And we're saying that so long as people are being oppressed by unfair, unequal power structures, they are not secure. So, therefore, challenging oppression, challenging unequal power structures, unequal distributions of power within society, this is security. You know, so we could talk about gender security, for example, or we could talk about, you know, equality in terms of racial equality, or we could talk about economic equality, or, you know, we could talk about freedom from, you know, post-colonial kind of power structures, for example. The idea that emancipation is security. So a completely different take on what security means and how we achieve it. So yeah, security from violence. And again, as we said last year, what do we mean by violence? Violence doesn't necessarily have to be physical violence. It could be that, but it could also be embedded structures within society, within the system, which cause harm. So again, as we said last year, 5 million children starve to death every year. And that's just the children, that's not even counting the adults. 5 million children starve to death every year. On a planet where there's enough food for everyone. In terms of food supply, there's no reason why anyone should starve. There's enough food on the planet to feed everyone. So why are 5 million kids starving per year? Obviously down to politics. So that, arguably, that is a form of violence. You know, violence doesn't just mean dropping bombs on people's heads. If people are starving, that is a form of violence. Violence embedded within the system, what we call systemic violence. So again, security, therefore, has emancipation from that. So we mentioned concepts like gender security, food security, environmental security. Cyber security, of course, important in the present day as well, although we're not going to really get time to talk about cyber security, which is a shame, really, because I've done quite a bit of work on that myself. But we'll try and squeeze it in as we go along. So again, that kind of brings us back to the weekly topics. So hopefully this now makes more sense. You know, each week we'll be looking at a different kind of angle on security. And again, in the early weeks we're going to be talking about the military and quasi-military stuff, so state on state, or civil war, also terrorism and so on, and then going on to talk about international crime. But then afterwards we'll talk about things like economic security, energy security, water security, food security, and so on. Okay, so we're almost out of time, but basically to summarise, security, what does it mean? It means being safe from danger or threat, but what sort of threat and whose security? Should we define security in terms of the security of the nation state or the security of the individual? And again, traditional approaches have focused more on national security, state security, but more recently there has been much more emphasis on human security. Paradigm, as we know, is a way of making sense of the world. It's a viewpoint on the world, a conceptual model based on a particular set of assumptions and values. The dominant security paradigm in any state at any given time is going to be dependent on lots of factors. So culture, history, political system, location in the world, prevailing ideologies, particularly among ruling elites, and so on. So again, much of this module deals with paradigm shifts, basically how views of security have changed over time and continue to do so. Okay, we're out of time, so if anyone has any questions, save them for the